Before the war, military theorists believed air power would make ground armies obsolete. The Douhet Theory suggested that massive bombing of cities would cause such panic that civilians would force their governments to surrender within weeks. However, World War II proved this was a fatal overestimation of psychological impact. From the London Blitz to the ruins of Berlin, history showed that bombing civilians didn't trigger revolution, it galvanized resilience. The miracle weapon of the air turned out to be a slow, grinding process of attrition rather than a surgical knockout blow. Strategic bombing also struggled against the sheer durability of industrial economies and technical limitations. Despite billions spent and thousands of crews lost, precision was a myth in the 1940s, and German war production actually increased under Allied raids until late 1944. Air power transformed the conflict and destroyed the enemy's infrastructure, but it could not replace the soldier on the ground. This series explores why the sky alone couldn't end the war, proving that while planes could break cities, they couldn't break the human will to fight. In the 1930s, the U.S. Army Air Corps boasted that their Norden bombsight could drop a bomb into a pickle barrel from 20,000 feet. This precision was the moral and strategic justification for daylight bombing: hit the factory, spare the city. But once the war began, the pickle barrel became a cruel joke. In reality, under combat conditions, facing heavy flak, fighter interception, and European weather, only about 20% of bombs dropped by the 8th Air Force fell within 1,000 feet of their target. The surgical strike was a fantasy, air power was a blunt instrument. Cloud cover was the greatest enemy of precision. Over Germany, clear skies were rare, forcing crews to use primitive radar or simply drop their loads through the overcast. This technical limitation turned intended precision missions into area bombing by default. If you couldn't hit a specific power plant, you leveled the entire industrial district and the residential zones around it. The high cost of this inaccuracy meant that the Allies had to drop millions of tons of explosives just to destroy a handful of critical targets, prolonging the war and multiplying civilian casualties. This lack of accuracy meant that the enemy's industrial heart could keep beating even under a rain of fire. A factory might be hit, but its heavy machinery often survived under the rubble, ready to be dug out and restarted in days. Because air power couldn't reliably kill a target with a single blow, it became a war of endless repetition. The Allies were forced to return to the same targets again and again, losing thousands of expensive bombers and elite crews to achieve what a single modern cruise missile could do today. The precision myth failed because it ignored the friction of real warfare. It turned a promised shortcut into a long, bloody slog of attrition. As the realization set in that factories couldn't be easily destroyed, the commanders turned to a darker strategy: if they couldn't break the machines, they would try to break the people who ran them. The most enduring myth of pre-war air doctrine was the morale collapse. Theorists like Julio Douhet and even some Allied commanders believed that civilians were the weak link in the national chain. They argued that if you rained enough fire on a city, the resulting terror, lack of sleep, and social chaos would trigger a popular uprising. They expected mothers to drag their husbands from the factories and demand an immediate surrender. But as the London Blitz of 1940 and the later Allied thousand-bomber raids proved, this theory was fundamentally wrong. Instead of shattering the human will, strategic bombing often acted as a powerful, albeit painful, social glue. When the Luftwaffe began the Blitz, they expected London to burn and its people to break. Instead, they witnessed the birth of the Blitz spirit. The shared experience of huddled basement shelters and the morning ritual of digging neighbors out of the rubble created a fierce sense of communal defiance. Bombing didn't make the British people hate their own government for failing to protect them, it made them hate the enemy who was trying to kill them. This psychological backfire repeated itself almost exactly when the Allies began their massive area bombing campaign against German cities like Hamburg and Cologne. The more the Allies bombed, the more the German population became dependent on the Nazi state for food, shelter, and basic survival, effectively tightening the regime's grip on the people. There is also a dark, practical reality to why morale didn't collapse: the numbness factor. After months of living under the sirens, the human psyche adapts to a state of permanent crisis. Survival becomes a full-time job. In Berlin or Tokyo, a civilian's day was consumed by searching for water, securing a meager ration of bread, and finding a safe place to sleep. There was no energy left for political revolution or organized resistance. Furthermore, the very nature of total war meant that the state had total control. In a police state like Nazi Germany or Imperial Japan, any attempt to demand surrender resulted in immediate execution. The bombers could destroy a man's home, his workplace, and his family, but they could not give him the tools to overthrow a dictator. By late 1944, the Allied command realized that morale bombing was a strategic dead end. They had leveled dozens of cities and killed hundreds of thousands of non-combatants, yet the German and Japanese war machines continued to function. The psychological shortcut to victory had proven to be a mirage. The lesson was clear but bitter. Air power could create a wasteland, but it couldn't create a surrender. To actually stop the enemy, the Allies had to move away from the hearts of the people and toward the lungs of the industry. They had to stop trying to make the enemy feel defeated and start making it physically impossible for them to fight. The greatest frustration for Allied commanders was a staggering reality: German war production didn't just survive the bombing, it increased. By 1944, after 3 years of heavy strategic raids, Germany was producing more aircraft, tanks, and ammunition than at the start of the conflict. This seemed impossible. How could an economy flourish while its cities were being reduced to ash? The answer lay in a combination of industrial resilience, strategic dispersal, and a brutal mobilization that Allied planners had completely underestimated. The primary reason for this survival was industrial dispersal. German planners realized early on that a massive, centralized factory was a death trap for heavy bombers. In response, they broke their production chains into thousands of small, hidden workshops located in forests, salt mines, and remote villages. If a main assembly plant was hit, the flow of parts from these decentralized subcontractors rarely stopped. Furthermore, heavy industrial machinery proved surprisingly difficult to destroy. A high-explosive bomb could blow the roof off a factory and kill the workers, but the massive steel presses and lathes often remained functional under the rubble. Within days, the debris was cleared, and the machines were humming again. This period also saw the transition to total war under Albert Speer. Before 1942, the German economy was only partially mobilized, maintaining a level of civilian comfort. The bombing forced the regime to rationalize every resource. Women, teenagers, and millions of slave laborers replaced the men in factories that began running 3 shifts a day. Paradoxically, the air raids helped the Nazis justify the most draconian control measures, turning the entire country into a singular military camp. Every destroyed civilian business simply freed up more hands for the war effort. Finally, the Allies suffered from a targeting crisis. For years, they couldn't agree on what to hit. One week it was ball-bearing plants, the next it was submarine pens, then aircraft factories. This scattergun approach allowed the German economy time to recover and adapt between raids. It wasn't until late 1944, when the Allies finally focused on 2 critical bottlenecks, transportation and oil, that the economic fortress began to crumble. Air power didn't win by destroying every factory, it won by cutting the veins that allowed the industrial heart to pump. One of the most hidden truths of World War II was that strategic air power was staggeringly expensive, both in treasure and in human lives. We often perceive bombers as a cheap way to wage war from a distance without engaging in ground battles. In reality, building and maintaining the massive fleets of B-17s, Lancasters, and B-29s was the most expensive industrial project in history. The U.S. heavy bomber program actually cost more than the Manhattan Project. It was a war of attrition where the Allies were consuming their own resources as fast as they were destroying the enemy's. The human cost was equally catastrophic. For much of the war, being a member of a bomber crew was the most dangerous job in the Allied military. In the U.S. 8th Air Force, the chances of surviving a full 25-mission tour were often less than 25%. More American airmen died in the skies over Europe than Marines died in the entire Pacific theater. Each lost bomber carried 10 highly trained specialists, pilots, navigators, and engineers, whose training took over a year. When a plane went down, the Allies didn't just lose a machine, they lost a concentrated pool of intellectual and military capital that was nearly impossible to replace at scale. The economic efficiency of these raids remained questionable for years. The value of the lost aircraft and the resources spent building them often exceeded the actual damage dealt to German industry. For instance, the infamous Schweinfurt-Regensburg mission cost the Allies 60 bombers and 600 crewmen in a single day, yet German ball-bearing production recovered to previous levels within weeks. It was a logistical gamble. The Allies hoped their industrial capacity could sustain these losses longer than Germany could afford to rebuild. This exorbitant price of the sky meant that air power could never be a standalone instrument of victory. It devoured a massive share of national wealth that could have been directed toward tanks, artillery, or landing craft. Had the US and Britain not possessed nearly infinite resources, strategic bombing might have led to their own economic exhaustion. Air power proved to be not an elegant surgical scalpel, but a massive meat grinder that demanded constant sacrifices to achieve a result. By mid-1944, Allied air superiority was far from a foregone conclusion. In fact, German defenses had become so lethal that the strategic bombing campaign teetered on the brink of collapse. The Reich had transformed into a steel fortress, protected by the flak system and cutting-edge interception technology. This was the moment where defensive capabilities began to outpace offensive power. While early in the war bombers seemed invincible, by 1944 every mission was a gamble against a sophisticated network of radar, heavy anti-aircraft artillery, and the world's first jet fighters. The primary defender was the 88mm flak gun, a weapon of terrifying versatility. Germany deployed over 20,000 anti-aircraft guns supported by the Kammhuber line, a radar network that could track bomber streams with mathematical precision. This wasn't just random fire. It was a coordinated system that created boxes of lethal shrapnel at specific altitudes. Flak accounted for half of all Allied bomber losses. Even when it didn't down a plane, it forced pilots to fly higher and faster, further degrading any hope of bombing accuracy. The sky over Germany had become a literal wall of steel that demanded a heavy toll for every mile advanced. German technological desperation also birthed the Me-262, the world's first operational jet. Flying 100 miles per hour faster than the best Allied escorts, it could tear through bomber formations with near impunity. The appearance of jets and early air-to-air rockets forced the Allied High Command to seriously consider suspending daylight raids altogether. The defense had become so efficient that loss rates were beginning to exceed the rate of replacement for both aircraft and trained crews. The air war was not won through the technical invulnerability of the bomber, but through a grueling battle of attrition. It was only the introduction of the P-51 Mustang, a long-range escort fighter, that finally tipped the scales by allowing the Allies to hunt the defenders in their own skies. Yet, even as the Luftwaffe crumbled, the ground-based flak remained a deadly threat until the final days of the war, proving that air power could never simply fly over the problem of a determined defense. As the smoke cleared from the ruins of German cities, the ultimate lesson of the conflict became impossible to ignore. No matter how much fire fell from the sky, the final word would always belong to the boots on the ground. By May 1945, the air power experiment had reached its limit. The Allies had dropped over 2 million tons of bombs on Europe, leveled every major German city, and dismantled the enemy's oil and transport networks. Yet, despite this unprecedented destruction, the war did not end with a white flag waved at a passing bomber. It ended only when the infantry cleared the last snipers from the ruins of the Reichstag and when the tanks of the Western Allies met the Red Army at the Elbe. The Douhet Theory, the idea that air power alone could force a surrender, had been definitively disproven. The sky could prepare the way, but it could not hold the territory. The legacy of the World War II bombing campaigns is one of sobering contradictions. While strategic aviation proved it could paralyze an industrial nation, it also showed that a determined population can endure almost any level of aerial terror. The war taught us that while you can destroy a factory from 30,000 feet, you cannot destroy the political will of a regime without a physical presence on the ground. This realization fundamentally shaped modern military doctrine. Air power is now seen as a force multiplier, a tool to be used in synergy with land and sea forces, rather than a magic wand for instant victory. The dream of the surgical, painless war from above died in the firestorms of Dresden and Tokyo. Today, the debate continues over the morality and efficiency of the air war. Critics point to the hundreds of thousands of civilian casualties as a stain on the Allied cause, while proponents argue that the pressure from the sky diverted millions of German soldiers and thousands of guns away from the front lines, saving countless Allied lives. Ultimately, the war proved that air power is the ultimate instrument of destruction, but a poor instrument of governance. To end a war, you must eventually look your enemy in the eye on the streets they call home. The story of air power in World War II is a reminder that technology rarely offers the shortcuts we hope for. It transformed the world and gave birth to the jet age and the space race, but it did not change the fundamental nature of conflict. War remains a human endeavor, won by the endurance of people and the physical occupation of the earth. The sky belongs to the planes, but the peace is still won by the soldier with a rifle. Thank you for watching. If you found this analysis valuable, subscribe to the channel for more history without myths.